Russia says its new hypersonic weapon is a technological breakthrough on the scale of Sputnik.
The year 2019 will be remembered for the wave of protests that swept the world, with millions of people protesting to demand change.
Witnessing an unprecedented wave of anger, millions of people have taken part in mass protests around the world recently.
Motivation for the demonstrations differ, but there's a commonly held view people are fed up with the status quo.
Often those demonstrations turned violent. Security forces killed in some countries like Iraq, and also used extreme force, leading to the deaths of several hundred people. In Hong Kong, the use of tear gas and live ammunition became common. Each protest movement had its own reasons, but they were united in their demand for democracy and fairness. Hong Kong's protests began in June against plans to allow people to be extradited to mainland China. Fighting between police and activists have become increasingly violent, with police firing live bullets and protesters attacking officers and throwing petrol bombs. People are demanding less influence from Beijing and the resignation of the leader Carrie Lam.
Cities around the world are alight. From Bogota to Baghdad, millions have taken to the streets.
We are seeing more unrest globally than we have at least in the last 30 or 40 years.
In many cases, protests have led to clashes with authorities and deaths. At least 26 in Chile in protests against cuts to social services, 11 in French Yellow Vest protests, and dozens in Iraq in countrywide anti-corruption demonstrations. While protests in Algeria, Georgia, Bolivia, Brazil, Mexico, Turkey and Hong Kong have also turned violent. The chaos in Colombia has reached critical levels. A curfew for the entire capital was put in place amid protests over systemic corruption.
In other news, China, Russia and Iran are set to hold joint naval drills in the Gulf of Oman.
This isn't just a military exercise, it's a political statement. The Strait of Hormuz is the world's most important oil artery. A fifth of our daily oil flows through it. 21% of global supply every day. It's a crazy amount.
China on Thursday said it will hold joint naval drills with Iran and Russia in the Indian Ocean and the Gulf of Oman. The maneuvers will begin Friday amid heightened tension in the region between Iran and the United States. China will send a guided missile destroyer. A Defense Ministry spokesman said the drill was a, quote, normal military exchange between the three armed forces and was in line with international law and practices.
They are aimed at deepening exchange and cooperation between their navies. This comes amid heightened tensions between the U.S. and Iran. Both sides have been at loggerheads since Washington reimposed sanctions on Tehran last year after withdrawing from a landmark nuclear deal. And there's also been months of tension between China and the U.S. over trade and what Beijing calls U.S. interference in its internal affairs, for instance, the situation in Hong Kong.
President Vladimir Putin says the avant-garde can easily bypass missile defense systems on its way to a target through sharp maneuvers. And that's worrying the U.S., that's also having to contend with China's development of hypersonic arms. Beijing displayed the Dongfeng 17 at a military parade in October. And the U.S. Defense Secretary has said developing the technology is a priority. Well, President Putin says Moscow is no longer playing catch-up.
If we want to be victorious, our equipment must be better than the equipment of other countries. It's not a game of chess where we can put up with a draw. Our equipment must be the best. We can strive for that. We are striving for that in key development areas.
Iran and Russia kicking off 4 days of joint naval war games in the Gulf of Oman and the Indian Ocean, as Tehran looks to improve military ties with Beijing and Moscow amid heightened tensions with the United States. Should the United States be about this effort made between these three countries? Certainly not our allies.
You know, these developments are important because they allow us and our public to understand what's the situation, the real situation with Iran. Often we have friends and allies in the region and beyond who are putting pressure on us. You need to do more on Iran, more in Iraq, more in Lebanon. The reality is that this joint exercise between Russia, China, and Iran is a message that these two powers, nuclear powers, are telling the United States and our allies that we're not, quote, going to let Iran down if you do anything against it. So the calculations now for the United States is to take into consideration that we're not just dealing with Iran, but also with an axis, a larger alliance, including those powers.
It appears the U.S. military has launched a missile strike in Iraq. The strikes appear to be retaliation for an attack against the U.S. embassy in Baghdad on Tuesday. Tonight, Iraqi state TV is reporting that among the people killed is Qasem Soleimani, a revered Iranian general and one of that country's most powerful military leaders. He's considered by the U.S. to be a terrorist.
Mourners have filled the streets of the southwestern Iranian city of Avaz, where the remains of Commander Qasem Soleimani have been returned from Iraq.
Are in the air as the funeral procession for Iran's top general Qasem Soleimani and Iraqi commander Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis arrives at the holy shrine in Najaf. Thousands have come to pay their respects here in Iraq. On the streets of Tehran, too. Here, Iranians demanded vengeance after a U.S. strike in Baghdad on Friday killed Soleimani.
Serious provocation tonight in the Strait of Hormuz after Iran seized a British tanker.
Iran seizing control of a British oil tanker. UK is accusing Iranian boats of trying to intercept a British oil tanker.
There seemed to be no end to this escalation. Washington and everyone with a warship or regiment to spare seemed to be rushing into the Persian Gulf. I mean, it wasn't the nicest neighborhood to begin with, what with Saudi Arabia and Iran, mortal enemies facing off across the tiniest of channels. And when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, they did.
The attack was launched from the north and was unquestionably sponsored by Iran.
Amid all the calls for de-escalation, Iran has now launched an unprecedented attack on the world's energy supply.
We took action last night to stop a war. We did not take action to start a war.
The U.S. president said Soleimani was responsible for the deaths of thousands of American service people over 2 decades.
Soleimani has been perpetrating acts of terror to destabilize the Middle East for the last 20 years. What the United States did yesterday should have been done long ago.
What is China and Russia and Iran? What's the message that's being sent here to the U.S., to the world? You know, but specifically, is there a message being sent to the U.S.?
Oh, definitely. I mean, the word saber rattling is used, over and over again, but I think there is a bit of that. I think the Russians and the Chinese are specifically saying, with respect to the crosshairs that are on Iran, is that to the United States and also to the Israelis and the Saudis and the other people pushing for military action against Iran, if you're thinking this is going to be a freebie, it's not going to be. It's not going to be easy. I don't think Russia and China want to go to war on behalf of Iran if hostilities break out, but they would certainly support Iran in every way short of war, and also to tell the United States and our satellites that they are prepared for war if it comes.
God willing, it is now time to clear and cleanse the region of these devils. It is now time to show more resistance to the Americans and show our resistance with action, to tell those Yankees to get out of here, get lost.
In the early hours of Friday morning, shortly after arriving at Baghdad International Airport, U.S. missiles killed Soleimani and his close ally, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, the deputy head of the Iranian-backed Iraqi militia, Hashd al-Shabi. Other members of the group were also killed in the attack. A drone strike hit their convoy as they left the airport.
What are some of the ways that they can push back, though, short of going to war?
I think among the ways they can push back is to supply a lot of weapons to Iran if a war breaks out. That they would supply a lot of weapons to Iran and any military and logistical supplies that are necessary to support Iran financially to make sure that Iran is able to carry on that fight. Let's remember, if we're stupid enough to do something with respect to Iran as we did to Iraq in 2003, Iran is a much bigger country, a much more difficult country to defeat militarily than Iraq was.
Absolutely, and how likely is that? You know, we've talked about it. I've talked about it with you. We've talked about with Michael Maloof, who's going to be on after you. You know, but what is the likelihood that the U.S. could go to war with Iran, or would it be more likely that it'd be Israel with the U.S. backing?
Well, the Israelis would never go to war with Iran by themselves, and neither would the Saudis. I mean, that's to say, it would have to be more than just U.S. backing. It would have to be direct U.S. participation. In other words, the United States carrying the load to do their dirty work for them. They're not going to do it on their own. And so I think I think there's always the question when the Israelis and the Saudis act provocatively toward the Iranians, are they just getting political mileage out of that? They gain more from the escalation of intentions than they would from the actual outbreak of hostilities, which open up Pandora's box of uncertainties about how that turns out. I don't think either Mohammed bin Salman or Bibi Netanyahu are crazy enough to actually launch such a war. I hope they're not, but I don't really know.
Right.
I don't really know. And they would have to be 100% sure that the United States would back them up and do the work for them. And I don't think they're quite sure about Trump. After he refused to take the bait when that drone was shot down, and he was expected within minutes of launching a strike against Iran, and then he didn't do it. I think that sent a chill through them.
How to tie this all together in?
Well, two things. One, I think for once in our lifetime, for at least of this network, let's give some credit to the Arabs. At last, the Arabs in this century are able to export something that's incredibly great to the rest of the world. And that was the spirit of the Arab Spring. That was the idea of a popular mobilization, the idea of non-ideological per se, not narrow, wide open, popular mobilization for reform.
Do you think that's what has inspired many other parts of the world?
Absolutely.
In the protests that we're seeing?
But also, of course, we've come at a time of history when this have come, like a couple of years before that, in the Green Revolution in Iran, certainly it's all coming around the time when the so-called social media has become pervasive among people, and certainly a great tool for organizing. Now,
U.S. cities remain on alert after an airstrike took out an Iranian terror leader in Iraq. Iran is vowing revenge.
And President Trump tonight says he took action to stop a war, not start one.
Attack of Iranian intelligence and military operations across the region for decades. A revered figure in Iran, today thousands mourning and protesting in Tehran. Iran's supreme leader vowing harsh retaliation and revenge.
And Iraqi politicians with close ties to Iran are calling for the roughly 5,000 U.S. troops based here in Iraq to be ordered out of the country in protest. What makes this situation so dangerous here in the Middle East is that the Iranians will feel that they have to retaliate. Qasem Soleimani was a national hero, part of the military genius of Qasem Soleimani, however we may judge him morally, was that he understood that Iran cannot compete head-on with the US. So he became a master of asymmetrical warfare, giving money and weapons to proxy groups and militia groups across the Middle East.
Generation, what we call millennials, speaking out, raging against the machine of often oppressive and corrupt governments and the wealthy elite, the 1% that gets richer while the rest continue to struggle. From Paris to Hong Kong, from Lebanon to Chile, the anger is the same. In many of these stories, it started with a smaller swell of movement growing into a large wave of protest for better living standards, quality of life, and higher wages, among many other demands. And one of the key ingredients in this recipe for resistance, the dismay and frustration that the rich keep getting richer. In fact, since 2010, look at this, Jeff Bezos, of course, of Amazon, made almost $100 billion more. Bernard Arnault, the chairman of the French company LVMH, which makes all those high-end products like Tag Heuer, watches, and the various really expensive perfumes and clothing, he made $82 billion in 10 years. Bill Gates, who has donated to various organizations and charitable organizations, made more than $50 billion in the last decade. Warren Buffett, almost $42 billion. Mark Zuckerberg upped his worth by $72 billion since 2010. And Mukesh Ambani, the Indian oil and gas tycoon, $30 billion. The list goes on and on.
That we're not going to allow you to seize and control this area and isolate Iran. This is very serious. That statement is very serious. And it could be also that they are willing, China and Russia that is, to send some of their parts of their fleets or ships into that area, which would complicate things. But this reminds me of something else. Our problem with Korea is very parallel. I mean, we think that we are only dealing with Korea. In fact, China and Russia are backing Korea. So it's much more of an international coalition business that we're dealing with now.
And